I'd like to welcome somebody who's come all the way from Calgary to come and share the message with us. His name is Jesse. He works with the Calgary Wesleyan Church as the, what's it called? I always forget what it's called. Resident pastor. So he's working in Calgary for 2 years. He's brought his lovely wife, Cassandra, and his son Micah with us here today. And he's come to share what God has laid on his heart. So please welcome Jesse.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's an honor and a privilege to be here this morning. Don't hate that I'm from Calgary. I like the Calgary Flames. I know most people here are probably Edmonton Oilers fans, and you guys beat us in the playoffs. So no grudges here right now. We'll get you guys this year. My son finds that funny. He doesn't know, but he's a Calgary Flames fan. So this morning, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37 to 40. That's where we're going to spend most of our time. But before that, I want to share with you a story about a dream I had many years ago. And how this dream worked is I was obviously sleeping and I'm in this dark place and all I could see was this light out in front of me. And there's hundreds of thousands of people all around me and they're just kind of walking towards this great light. And as we get closer and closer and closer to this great light, it's not a great light that you would walk into. All of a sudden it's like this big blazing flame where people are just running headward first into it. And then I wake up. And all I could think about was the hundreds of thousands and millions of people all around the world jumping headward first into eternity without knowing God in a place called hell. And how much we're supposed to love people and we're supposed to run into the fire and pull people out. Which brings me to my next story of a person I knew in my past who was super gifted, super talented, and I had an opportunity to share with him, and I did, but at that moment he never accepted the free gift of salvation that God offered him. And years later I come to find out that he eventually committed suicide, one of the most talented people I have ever met in my entire life. When I talk about a person that could play hockey and probably could have played professionally, he probably could have. That's how talented he was. And I could just see the talent and ability that he was just throwing away. So which gets me back to the title of this sermon is Our Passion is People. To tell people about the love that Jesus can offer to them. So Matthew 21, verse 37 to 40 says, "You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind." And the second is equally important, to love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and the demands of the prophets are based off these two commandments. The Bible is the greatest love story ever told. It is based off of love, of how much God loved us, that he would send his son to the cross to die for us. So the older I get, the more I realize that if it's not God first in my life, then he's last in my life. God doesn't want to be second or third place in your life. He wants to be first in everything. And when he's first, I think clearer, I walk with integrity, I understand my purpose. But when he's not first in my life, things quickly crumble, I don't think clearly, I'm not convicted. What I realize is that when he's glorified, I'm satisfied. The reason that I love Jesus is because he first loved me. And he calls us to give up everything and follow him. What has Jesus done for you? Everything. Everything. That's why he deserves everything in return. Since the fall of man, God put into motion this plan of sending his son Jesus to the cross. to redeem his people back to himself. He loves us deeply, a love that we can't even comprehend. A love that surpasses all of our understanding. A love that to you and me makes no sense. To us human beings, sometimes we have conditions on the word love. We only go to a certain point and then we cut it off. But that's not God. God continues to chase after us. Continues to run after us to the point where he sent his only son, someone who did no wrong, to the cross to die for us. If it was just for you, if it was just for me, he still would have went there for one person. Billy Graham said, true love is the act of the will. A conscious decision to do what is best for the other person instead of ourselves. Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. The word love is mentioned about 900 times in the Bible. Did you know that when God looks at us, he doesn't see Jesse, doesn't see Nick, doesn't see you. He sees his son. Once we accept that free gift of salvation, he no longer sees me. He sees the Son of Jesus working through me. And because of that, we can walk into the gates of heaven because of that, because of what Jesus did. The greatest commandment of all is to love God and to love people. For example, let's look at John 13, verse 34 and 35. It says this, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. You must love one another, and by this, they will know that you are my disciple, if you love one another.
Really?
One day, an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength, and all your mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Right, Jesus told him. Do this and you will live. The man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead on the side of the road. By chance, a priest came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side and passed him by. The temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed him by. A despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan smothered his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged him up. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to the inn, where he took care of him. The next day, he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man. If his bills run higher than this, I'll pay you back the next time I'm here. Now, which of one of these 3 would you call was a neighbor to the man? Jesus asked. The man replied, the one who showed him mercy. Then Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. You know, often when we think of our neighbor, we think of the person sitting next to us or the person that lives next to us. But that's not what Jesus is explaining here. Jesus is explaining every single person we come in contact with on a daily basis is our neighbor. And are we going to show them compassion when they're having a bad day, or are we just going to turn the other way and pretend we don't see it? The second point I want to share with you guys is that love changes all things. Let's just look what's happening in the world around us. The war that's happening in Ukraine, all the people that have been displaced from their homeland. And it's just not been happening in Ukraine, it's been happening in many countries around the world for a long time. Ukraine is just the most recent incident of this. We think about all the people that are struggling here in North America just to make ends meet. And we look at social media where it just seems like you're fighting hate with hate, and you disagree with someone on something, and no longer you can be friends again if you have a different opinion or a different belief. It's even hard to watch the news every day because it's filled with just negativity day in and day out about what's wrong with the world, even though there are great things that happen around the world every single day, every single hour. Let's look at the life of Jesus. He says the two greatest commandments is to love God and love people. To love everyone around us. Love truly changes all things. What would your life look like without Jesus? I know what mine would look like. I'd be lost, broken, trying to understand the world. I want to share you of two stories from the Bible. The first one is in Matthew 27, verse 11 to 26. It's the story of Barabbas. And this is such an important story, but when you go in its normal context, when you're going through this scripture, sometimes the story can be overlooked just because of the great miracle of this whole Easter story, what this is a part of. And it starts with, now Jesus was standing before Pilate, the Roman governor. He asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? Asked the governor. Jesus replied, you have said it. But when the leading priests and the elders made their accusations against him, Jesus remained silent. Don't you hear all these charges they are bringing against you? Pilate demanded, but Jesus made no response to any of these charges. Much to the governor's surprise, now it was the governor's custom each year during the Passover celebration to release one prisoner to the crowd, anyone they wanted. This year there was a notorious prisoner, a man named Barabbas. As the crowds gathered before Pilate's house that morning, he asked them, which do you want to be released to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called the Messiah? He knew very well that the religious leaders had Jesus arrested out of envy. Just then, as Pilate was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent this message to him, leave this innocent man alone. I suffered through a terrible nightmare last night because of him. Meanwhile, the leading priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas to be released instead, for Jesus to be put to death. So the governor asked again, which of these two do you want me to release to you? The crowd shouted back, Barabbas, Barabbas, Barabbas. Pilate responded, then what should I do with the so-called Messiah? They shouted back, crucify him. Why? Pilate demanded. What crime has he committed? But the mob roared even louder, crucify him. Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere with this, and the riot was developing. So he sent for a bowl of water and washed his hands before the crowd and said, I am innocent of this man's blood. The responsibility is yours. And all the people yelled back, we will take responsibility for his death, we and our children. So Pilate released Barabbas to them and ordered Jesus to be sent to death. There's so much importance, and this whole thing could preach on its own. But Jesus could have spoke up at any moment and stopped it, broke the chains, and all of that. But at that moment, he understood his purpose. He understood that he needed to go to the cross. And I also think that he understood that Barabbas needed some grace in his life. Even though we have no idea if Barabbas ever accepted Jesus or not. But I think in that moment that Jesus wanted to be treated like Barabbas, and he wanted Barabbas to be treated like Jesus. Even though Barabbas had all these problems in his life. But it was a moment when Jesus could have said anything, and he chose to be silent because he knew the will of the Father. And he knew that this was the only way. The second story I want to share with you is about a man named Peter. Luke 22, verse 54 to 62. And this before them, like Jesus going with like them taking Jesus to be in prison. This is while it's happening. And they seized him, led him away, bringing him to the high priest's house. And Peter was following at a distance. And when they had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat down among them. Then a servant girl, seeing him as he sat in the light, looking at him closely, said, "This man was one with him." And Peter denied it, saying, "Woman, do you do not what you know?" And now a little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are also one of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." And after an interval of about an hour, still another insisted, saying, "Certainly this man also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are talking about." And immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered saying of the Lord, "Before the rooster crows today, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. So just to give you some context, the night before, Jesus and Peter are talking, and Jesus says to Peter, "You're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter, who was always bold about his faith, said, "No way, I will not deny you." And here's Peter in a difficult situation where he's not surrounded with his friends, Jesus is not there, and all of a sudden the fear overwhelmed Peter, and he denied Jesus 3 times. In John 21 it says, "So when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said, 'Then feed my lambs.' He said to him again a second time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' He said, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said, 'Tend my sheep.' He said to him a third time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' And Peter was grieved because he said to him a third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said, 'Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said, 'Feed my sheep.'" 3 times Peter denied Jesus. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" Because what Jesus is saying is like, I'm providing a way for you. I fought death for 3 days for you, and I conquered it for you. And now I'm asking you, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Because if you do, then go out and tell people about me. Take care of my sheep. Love them. But if you study this passage in the Greek, everything changes. Because what Jesus is saying, he's saying, "Peter, do you agape love me?" That first love in the Greek, it's agape, which means, do you love me with everything? Peter says, well, I valeto love you, which means I have affection towards you. I don't love you with everything, Jesus. I can't believe I can say that right now because I denied you 3 times. So if you're asking me if I agape love you, well, I valeto love you. And what Jesus is saying, no, Peter, do you agape love me? What Jesus is saying, I want more than your affection. I want more than your words. I want your life. Sometimes I look back on my life and I think about all the times that Jesus looked at me like, hey, Jesse, do you love me? Yeah, I do, Jesus. I go to church. I read my Bible. No, 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 no. Jesse, do you love me? I preach on the street corner for you, Jesus. I'm not talking about your works. I'm asking you about your heart. Do you love me? And so many times, I think back on all the times that Jesus asked me, do you love me? And I could never say I agape loved him because I remember what I did the day before. or the night before, and I was reminded of all my failures and faults. So I'm here to tell you today that Jesus doesn't define you by your failures. He defines you by your faithfulness. What Jesus is saying is like, I don't want your lip service, Peter. You're not understanding me. If you really love me, your life's going to show it. You're going to serve people. And what's so beautiful is that he's restoring him back into ministry here. Like, even though you slipped up and failed me, I'm telling you to go be a leader in ministry. Lead people. Tend to my sheep. Billy Graham said, when Christ fills our heart, it puts selfishness on the run. When we look at the life of Jesus, Jesus was the greatest servant of all time. He was the Son of God, and he still washed the disciples' feet, when most people think it should have been the other way. But he was giving us an example of how to serve people, of how to really love. Jesus, being God, coming down and being human, took all the pain, all the suffering, all the sin, all the sins that were committed in the past, that were ever going to be committed in the future. He took it upon himself. And he said, you know what? I'm going to go and die for that person. I'm going to die for that person as well. I'm going to wash their feet. How can I serve? The third point I want to share with you today is that it's Jesus over everything. I don't want to preach a cheap gospel to you guys this morning because, number one, I love you guys too much, and number two, because I fear God. And I fear that when I stand before him, he's going to ask me, what did you tell people when you stood on stages? And I just want to say, I told them exactly what you said. You know, there are going to come moments in our lives when God is going to ask us to give up certain things in our life. Maybe the thing that is taking too much control over us, maybe taking too much time. What's keeping us from that agape love? That love where it's Jesus over everything and not everything over Jesus. Not just having an affection towards him, but having a love for him that's all-consuming. To the point where we can't help but go up to people and say, hey, you know what, man, God loves you. It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter where you've been. Jesus only cares about right now. We are called every single day to be more sold out for Jesus, to look more like Jesus every single day. So my question to you is, do you love God with everything that you are? It says this in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21 to 23. Not everyone who calls out to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who actually do the will of the Father in heaven will enter. On judgment day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did I not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, perform many miracles in your name? But I will reply, I never knew you. Get away from me, you who break God's law. One of the things I've come to understand is, as important as our works are, that God doesn't care about them. What he cares about is our heart. And because he cares about our heart, us serving him only comes from that. Not from a selfish, prideful side. It comes from a side of loving people, an authentic side. A side of doing away with our own prideful situations, but actually loving people. I don't know if you wonder this, but sometimes I wonder what's the point of getting up. Wake up, go to work, put it on repeat for the next day. Does it feel empty? For many years, I lived that life, where I would get up, go to work, come home, clean up, go to bed. And I wonder what the point is. Working for money and dreaming of, a 1 week vacation every year, barely able to afford it. We live for titles at work that will soon be forgotten. We kill ourselves for a piece of that Canadian/American dream that North American culture tells us about. But what happens when those dreams don't satisfy? And that void still hurts in our gut. You were created for more than the corporate ladders and the dreams of owning your own pool. You were made to radically impact your culture with love. You were designed to change the world, every single one of us. I don't know how many times I've heard it, well, I'm no good, God can't use me. Well, if you look at every single person in the Bible, each one of them had their own faults. Each one of them had their own hang-ups. Even Peter the rock, denied Jesus. God still used him. God never intended you to live an ordinary life. He wants you to move mountains. Want to live, and I mean actually live? Break out. Follow Jesus. Be a rebel. Live for something greater than the poor man's pursuit of property and prosperity. Real satisfaction only comes from knowing your purpose. Knowing your purpose only comes from knowing your Creator. Want your life to matter? Give it away. And then you'll find it. The cross was the most horrific and embarrassing instrument of death in the days of Christ. It was vile and repulsive. It was offensive and humiliating. Still, Jesus chose to die there. Why? He could have chosen any form of death, and it would have had enough impact to take God's wrath. He chose the cross because he was showing us that only God can take something so wretched and vile and make it into something beautiful. A symbol of forgiveness, symbol of love. God specializes in turning broken things into his masterpiece for his glory. And he can do the same thing in your life. Only Jesus can make sinners and make them clean. You can be forgiven and changed by repenting and believing in the name of Jesus. After all, Jesus didn't stay on the cross. Jesus is alive, he's still moving, he's still working, and he is still in the business of saving lives. God is at work all around us. Oftentimes we're too busy, or we say we are when we're really not. Well, we can't slow down enough to see God at work all around us every single day. We consume our life with so many things, and we just don't give him any space. We'll go to work, we'll be driving home, and then we get home, we get supper. If you have kids, you get kids to bed, and by the end of the night, you're like, I just want to go to bed. And there's no room for God, but we have to be making room for him. And when we make room for him, we'll be able to make room for others in serving them. And it allows God to work through our life. Right? Which gets us back to our main passage this morning, which was Matthew 22, 37 to 40. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and the second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and the demands of the prophets are based off these two commandments. If you could all stand with me for a moment. I want to tell you something that I think is very important. The greatest trick that the devil wants to play on you is to get you to believe that he isn't real. To get you to... And he said, if I don't go there and pay the price for their sins, one day they would go to a place far worse than here, in a place called hell. So I want to break down the gospel as simply as I can for each and every one of you. And it looks like this, that every single one of us is born into a fallen world, a sinful world. And when that sin infects us through our decisions to not be obedient to God, we now have a disease that's called sin. Every single one of us. And in that sin, we will be God, not as our Savior, but as our judge. And He will say, you will be punished. And for all of eternity, you will be in hell. Jesus talked more about hell than He ever mentioned heaven. Not that He was a killjoy. It's just He loved people enough to tell them, hey, look, this is where you're going. This is where you're heading. All of us, I don't care how much money you have. I don't care who your lawyer is. I don't care how strong you are, how big you are. I don't care about any of it. Nothing can get you out of this. But Jesus can. You see, that's the bad news of the gospel. But here's the good news. And it's the bad news that makes the good news so good. And the good news looks like this. That God knew you couldn't work your way to Him. He knew that you couldn't be perfect people. He knew you couldn't be perfect people, so He sent Jesus. And Jesus lived a sinless, perfect life for you. And at age 33, He went to a cross for you. He gave up His life for you. He took those whips, He took those lashes, and on the cross, He thought about you. And He took your sin, and He died. But we do not serve a dead king. Death could not hold Him. And He walked out of the tomb as a victor. And He's coming back as a warrior. And He's saying now that the gate to heaven is wide open. If you just come through me, God will no longer see you as a sinner, but instead will see you as a son. Because the righteousness of my life will be on your life, and the punishment that I took will no longer be on your head, and my resurrection will mean that you're redeemed. Come to me, come to me, come to me. He loves you. All the more reason to love Him back. With more than just our words, but with our life. I'm going to pray. If there's anyone in this room that has not committed their life to Jesus, I want to make a place for you right now. For you to accept the gift that Jesus is offering you. The gift of salvation, the gift of knowing your Creator, and the gift of a new beginning, a fresh start. And it's simple, and it's by saying a few simple words. There's no specific way in saying it, but just praying from your heart to God, saying, Lord, save me, make me new. I believe you died for me, and I'm asking you to save me. However you say that, there's no specific words. Just from your heart to God, talk to Him. And He will make all things new. So Lord, we come to you in thanksgiving and just gratefulness for everything that you've done for us. The unseen things that we don't see, the unseen dangers that you keep away from us. Or I'm just thankful of you going to the cross for us 2,000 years ago. There was no other way. And I'm thankful for the lessons that you teach us to love people as you love people, to serve people. Or whoever in this congregation needed to hear that this morning, may it speak to them. May it resonate in their heart. May you speak to their heart. Because you're the only one who saves. We
we just thank you for who you are. And we pray this in your name.